Telling scary stories has always been in our nature, and for ages we've been telling tales of one particular monster. One so terrifying that its legend has lasted for literal centuries, in various countries and languages all around the world. This beast has lived in our nightmares for generations.
We drank the blood of some people, but the people were on drugs, and now I'm a wizard.
Well, some of them live in our nightmares. Bloodsuckers, demons of the night, known by many names, but most commonly...
vampire.
Alright, so as you can see, they're everywhere. Just in 2024 alone, there were plenty of movies and TV shows centered around vampires. Horror movies like Abigail and Salem's Lot, the already iconic TV shows of What We Do in the Shadows and Interview with the Vampire. And now, a highly anticipated and critically acclaimed remake of the classic that helped make vampires and Count Dracula a part of our culture,
Nosferatu.
The original film was released over 100 years ago, which is kind of wild to think about, and it was heavily based on the timeless tale that is Bram Stoker's Dracula. Since then, vampires have been everywhere in the media, including books, music, movies, and TV shows, leading to countless variations of these monsters with multiple movies a year riffing off the same story of Dracula specifically. In fact, a quick Google search shows that there are over 200 existing films featuring some version of Dracula, which just begs the question, why are we bothering to retell a story that we already know? And more specifically, one that has been told again and again and again over multiple generations. As consumers of media, we claim that we crave more original stories and films, but then we just keep going back to watch another variation of a too familiar vampiric tale. When 2024's Nosferatu was announced a few years back, it seemed like everyone was excited for it, even though we already knew it's just a rehashing of Dracula. What is it about vampires that gives them the ability to keep audiences entertained for centuries, even including films that use a plot that we know like the back of our hand? Is our obsession warranted, or is this newest film an unnecessary retelling of a worn-out tale? Robert Eggers' Nosferatu quickly became a box office hit on the big screen, and the subject of a plethora of memes on our phones.
Do you mean not that close?
You must bounce on it.
So join me as we dive into the new film, the history of Nosferatu, the legend of vampires themselves, and how this well-known myth continues to permeate our horror-loving society.
Creatures with sharp teeth, stupid accents.
If you like this video and would like to see more, please like and subscribe. Thanks. The Nosferatu, or more accurately, Count Orlok, is obviously not as big of a household name as Dracula, but it seemed the horror and cinephile community were pretty hyped when this remake was announced. And while it doesn't hurt that it's being helmed by a celebrated horror director with a dedicated cult following. We know Dracula has had hundreds of remakes and references throughout the years, but this isn't even the first adaptation of the 1920s Nosferatu film either, as we had an excellent version, Nosferatu the Vampire, that was released in 1979, and another remake released just 1 year ago. Also, there is Shadow of the Vampire, a movie loosely based on the production of the original, and funnily enough starred Willem Dafoe as character actor Max Schreck and Orlok. Anyway, despite many of us knowing how the plot of this film was basically going to unfold, I, like my fellow horror fanatics, went to the theater to see Nosferatu on opening weekend and also nabbed myself a coffin popcorn bucket. Without popcorn, of course, to keep the little rats inside nice and butter-free. Consumerism at its finest, really.
I'm in control here, and you're gonna give me what I want. You know what it is. Give me what I want.
I thought Eggers' rendition of Nosferatu was impressive, which honestly was expected since I like his 3 other films, The Lighthouse being my favorite. Nosferatu is clearly set to become another cult classic to add to his existing set of iconic horror movies. It was faithful to the original and showed respect to many aspects of the old film. The cinematography is especially breathtaking, as it is dark and moody with strong contrasting lighting, successfully evoking a macabre, beautiful, gothic aesthetic that also harkens back to the visuals of the 1920s version. The whole film felt artistic and grand, while still intimately reeling you in with the powerful acting and intense sound design. I mean, I still hear Orlok slurping up blood like he's shotgunning a beer or something.
Drink.
Nah, I'm good, man.
Nosferatu is wholly different from a lot more of these action-based scary movies that you see widely released in theaters that are pumped out by larger studios. Not that all those are bad, obviously, but it's certainly a nice change of pace to see a slow burn, poetic movie that is plastered around on billboards and commercials to get people in the theater. I know there are a couple of controversial points of the movie, but I do think the acting was great for the most part, and Nosferatu himself was effectively creepy and threatening. I do wish I saw his little rat-like fangs more, since you know that is like a huge part of his original design. Also, I expected the film to be a little bit more strange, like Eggers' past films, but besides that, the movie definitely managed to become a favorite of mine for 2024. I hope this remake exposes a new generation of audiences to the first Nosferatu, as the fantastic silent film is a true classic that went on to influence not just the horror genre of cinema, but film itself. It's kind of crazy to think that the original movie came out over a century ago. Nosferatu, A Symphony of Horror was a silent film released in 1922 in Germany, directed by F.W. Murnau, and also starring Max Schreck as Count Orlok the Vampire, or as they say in the film, Nosferatu. Like I mentioned before, it was an unofficial adaptation of the famous novel Dracula by Bram Stoker. Some details were changed, including the names of all the characters, but it still copied Dracula's stories so much that it almost got copyright claimed out of existence. The Stoker family, specifically his widow, sued for copyright infringement, and the court ordered all copies of the film to be destroyed. Thankfully, some copies survived, and the movie went on to become a horror staple, inspire prospective filmmakers, and influence the future of cinema. Because of its iconic cinematography, it was critically acclaimed upon its release. In fact, the visuals were so clear and perfect at the time that some criticized it for being a little too different from the horror movies that came before. Nosferatu only had a handful of remakes since then, but the well-known story it's based on has had hundreds of variations throughout the years. The first actual Dracula film came out in 1931, and after it showed to be a clear success, multiple sequels soon followed. Dracula has had remakes upon remakes upon remakes in the near 100 years since then, and they certainly don't seem to be slowing down anytime soon. Maybe you've seen one of them. How about Dracula? Or Dracula? Maybe Dracula AD 1972. Or let's jump ahead to Dracula 2000. And then maybe a millennium forward to Dracula 3000. You might recognize a specific actor as Dracula, like Bela Lugosi,
Here.
Christopher Lee, Gary Oldman, or more recently, Nicolas Cage.
I am Dracula.
The Count has been the center of horror films for sure, but also action, comedies, romances, animes, and animated kids movies. And of course, after Dracula made such an impact on our society, vampires of all shapes and sizes started popping up in their own horror and non-horror films, shows, and books. We quickly became entranced by these cold, sharp-toothed beasts, making them not only an inducer for fear, but sometimes the object of our desires, and even a source for laughs as we parody them as well. So, we've been watching and reading and talking about vampires for centuries, but what about them keeps us coming back for more? Vampires have been a part of our world for as long as any of us have been alive, so by now we're so self-aware of our obsession with these creatures that we put them in all sorts of situations. They're not just horror icons, but pop culture icons too. We have especially popular vampires like Dracula, Blade, and Edward that are referenced all the time. But the love for the original white rat boy Count Orlok is significantly lacking. Luckily for me, I've known about him for a long time because of a certain children's television show that features a sponge.
And who was flickering the lights?
Nosferatu!
It felt a bit random then, but now looking back it feels wonderfully niche and cultured for a kids show, and helped introduce me to this weird little freak. Also, Robert Eggers himself recently thanked SpongeBob for this reference and introducing young viewers to the classic monster 2 decades ago, kind of prepping us all as adults to watch this movie. And Eggers said that his earliest memory of Nosferatu actually came from Muppet Babies, when they would feature clips of old films. Anyway, this is just another example that proves vampires, including Nosferatu, have been permeating all forms of media and pop culture since almost the beginning of moving pictures. So how did a monster like the vampire get to become such a common narrative in film, and at times overdone cliche, and even a joke featured in kids shows? Well, like so many good stories that stand the test of time, vampires started out as tales told by oral tradition. Here's my little history lesson part of the video. The origin of the folklore can't be pinpointed exactly, as stories of beasts like these were told all over the world hundreds of years ago. It is also further complicated by how one defines vampire. Vampires, at their simplest, are undead humans that feast on the blood of the living. But texts describing different kinds of humanoid beasts that feast on humans were both in ancient Greek and medieval European stories, as they featured creatures and corpses drinking blood and other human bodily fluids. But, again, we do know that the earliest instances in writing at least go as far back as 1,000 years ago in Eastern Europe, or what is now Bulgaria. What we think of as a vampire today mostly originates from Gothic European literature from as early as the 18th century, and the various plagues that ravished this part of the world certainly fed into the lore. Since, people were dying left and right, and naturally we wanted a villain to blame. People would even dig up buried corpses to ensure no vampire was afoot. Ironically, they found that these recently deceased and decomposing bodies had long, pointy fingernails and exaggerated teeth as the gums receded after death, and this could have underscored their belief as to what vampires looked like. This and word of mouth helping it circle around Europe, the myth and fear of vampirism peaked. Poetry started to be written about vampires, with Der Vampir in 1748, followed by the first prose story, The Vampire, in 1819. Many of these poems and stories of vampires involve the creature seducing young women. So let's just make a quick note of that for now. During the mid-1800s, many classic vampire stories were written, and eventually these led to arguably the most well-known vampire story of all time, Bram Stoker's Dracula. The horror genre was forever changed, with vampires becoming a staple. Vampire lore endured centuries of retellings without the public losing interest. How are we not possibly tired of another movie or TV show or book that features these predictable bloodsuckers? Well, I think it comes down to three things. First off, tradition and familiarity. We grew up knowing about these monsters, and as humans, we always have a soft spot for something that is, familiar. Secondly, their design honestly makes for a great villain. For the most part, their appearance and traits in modern books, plays, movies, and TV shows tend to follow the most famous iteration of the creature. Pale skin, inhuman abilities like shapeshifting and mind control, their blood-only diet, weaknesses in the form of sunlight and wooden stakes, and of course, constant seduction of women, all of which appeared in both Dracula the novel and film. They are frightening, but by appearing as humanoid, we could, at least at times, form a connection with them. They are powerful, mystical, and formidable, but not impossible to defeat. A being that could kill us with one blow or drain us of our life source, while still being killable by the hero of the story, gives us hope to offset the dread. The third aspect is how these monsters have the capability to play with our emotions of fear and longing as they seesaw back and forth. Like I mentioned, they are a great villain. As humans, we are innately fascinated with things that make our adrenaline rush, our blood pumping. Something that makes vampires unique compared to other supernatural beasts is that we can romanticize them. Since practically their origin, they have been known to seduce and desire humans. And sometimes we desire them right back.
Come to me. Hear my call.
Granted, many times, vampires specifically seduce young women in order to get them alone to then suck their blood, but in many modern iterations, it's also been portrayed in a more romantic and non-lethal sense. Even in the original Dracula novel, sexuality was hugely suggested, as the act of feeding on one's blood was innately intimate in nature. They are literally made to lure humans in, with either their magic abilities or just a severe attractiveness.
You find this beautiful? Magical.
Fear is not the only deeply human motivator. Lust and longing are common ones as well. And as fragile, mortal humans, a relationship with a vampire would be the ultimate forbidden fruit. They made 5 Twilight movies for a reason. Audiences were hooked by the romance and Romeo and Juliet love dynamic. Not every vampire movie or book has this romantic aspect, of course, but it really helped keep vampires relevant these last few decades as they reach new audiences. Ironically, Nosferatu takes a bit of a different turn, since it's not his attractiveness or good-heartedness that's doing it for Ellen here. As we are constantly surrounded by today's common, more enchanting depiction of vampires, Count Orlok is almost depicted as objectively ugly and scary. His physical appearance emphasizes a mostly bald head, pointed nose and ears, and sharp front teeth to the point of resembling animals like bats and rats. It is mostly true to the original film, and in this modern age of movies, it is a great reminder that the origin of vampires did not always put them in a beautiful light. They are literally based on corpses, something that should frighten us. Granted, his appearance in the 2024 version is not stopping some viewers from thirsting over him, but maybe that's a conversation for another time. There is still a bit of gothic beauty to the relationship, though, as it is brought on by this intense loneliness both of them felt. But we know it's not truly Ellen's desire to be with him, not in the emotional sense at least. He is still a monster, despite the sadness that haunts him. This aspect really helps set the movie apart from the more mainstream vampire stories that we are bombarded with daily. The story of Nosferatu, despite being an old and familiar one, still manages to be welcomed in today's vampire-saturated media. Sure, the tale of Dracula has been told countless times, but we don't seem to be protesting that. As writer Holly Black said, in every generation comes a vampire. And as their movies keep coming out year after year, that definitely seems to be true. Their stories transcend time and stretch across countless cultures. The legend of vampires and the story of Dracula/Nosferatu have proven to be timeless. I believe this Nosferatu was a successful addition to this ever-growing subgenre of horror. The artistic, moody, gothic aesthetic that Eggers made sure to include showed respect to the original while still putting his spin on it. And Nosferatu himself had a refreshing design that separates him from many of the vampires of today. Even though it is technically another remake of the Dracula story, the movie is a great way to get a new generation educated on a true classic silent horror film that helped change cinema forever. Vampires will continue to be everywhere on the big and small screen. They are the perfect villain, and at times an alluring paramour. Their story has lasted centuries, and even though we're no longer the grave-digging society that originated the myth, these bloodsuckers are here to stay.